The ballroom shimmered with 1,000 tiny lights, each one catching the swirl of satin and laughter. But in the corner, unnoticed, an old woman clutched a brooch so tightly her knuckles whitened, her eyes locked on the bride. This was no ordinary night for Eleanor, and the weight of 70 years pressed against her chest. Eleanor's hands trembled as she watched her granddaughter, Lily, glide across the dance floor, her white gown trailing like a whisper of dreams. The brooch in Eleanor's palm wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was her mother's, a relic of love and loss, passed down through generations, now destined for Lily's gown. It was a sapphire flower, its petals etched with memories of war, sacrifice, and a promise kept against all odds. Eleanor's mother, Clara, had worn it on her own wedding day in 1942, pinning it to her dress as her soldier fiancé, Thomas, shipped out to the front lines. He never returned. The brooch had since become a talisman, a silent vow that love endures beyond the grave. Eleanor's breath hitched as she remembered the day she'd inherited it. She was 16, and Clara, frail from years of grief, had pressed it into her hands. "Keep it safe," she'd whispered, "for the one who'll carry our story forward." Eleanor had worn it at her own wedding, and now, as Lily twirled under the chandeliers, it was time to pass it on. But the act felt heavier than she'd expected. To fasten it to Lily's gown was to surrender a piece of herself, to trust her granddaughter with a legacy that had shaped their family's heart. The reception pulsed with life. Children darted between tables, couples swayed to a slow jazz tune, and the clink of champagne glasses filled the air. Eleanor sat alone at a table draped in white linen, her silver hair catching the light like a halo. She was 82, her body frail but her eyes sharp, carrying the weight of decades. She'd raised Lily after her parents died in a car accident when Lily was just 6. Those years had been a tapestry of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and late-night talks about love and courage. Now, Lily was 25, radiant, and about to begin a new chapter with her groom, Daniel. Eleanor's gaze drifted to Daniel, a kind-eyed man with a laugh that filled the room. He reminded her of Thomas in a way, gentle but resolute. She wondered if Lily knew how rare that was, how love like that could anchor a soul or break it. As the band struck up a new song, Eleanor rose, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. She had to do this now, before the moment slipped away. She approached Lily, who was laughing with her bridesmaids, her face glowing with joy. "Grandma," Lily exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "You look beautiful." Eleanor smiled, but her heart raced. She opened her palm, revealing the sapphire brooch. "This was your great-grandmother's," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "She wore it when she married." "So did I? Now it's yours." Lily's eyes widened, her fingers brushing the brooch's delicate petals. "It's stunning," she whispered. "But are you sure?" Eleanor nodded, though her chest tightened. She pinned the brooch to the bodice of Lily's gown, her fingers lingering on the fabric. The crowd around them faded, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, bound by a thread of history. As Eleanor stepped back, a man appeared at Lily's side, not Daniel, but someone unfamiliar, his face weathered but kind. He wore a suit that seemed slightly out of place, too formal for the casual elegance of the reception. "May I have a word?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Lily frowned, glancing at Eleanor, who felt a strange prickle of recognition. She didn't know this man, yet something in his eyes stirred a memory she couldn't place. He introduced himself as Henry, a friend of Lily's late mother, Sarah. "I knew your mother when we were young," he said, his gaze flickering to Eleanor. "She spoke of you often, Eleanor. And of that brooch." Eleanor's heart skipped. Sarah had died so young, and Eleanor had buried those memories deep, too painful to revisit. Henry's presence was a twist she hadn't expected, a crack in the evening's joy that let old grief seep through. Henry leaned closer, his voice dropping. "There's something you both should know about that brooch. It's not just a family heirloom." Eleanor's grip tightened on her cane. What could he mean? The brooch was Clara's, a symbol of her love for Thomas. What else could it be? Henry's eyes held a secret, and Eleanor felt the weight of the past pressing closer, threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew. Eleanor's heart thudded as Henry's words hung in the air. The ballroom's warmth felt stifling now, the chatter and music a distant hum. She stared at him, searching his face for answers. But his expression was unreadable, a mix of sorrow and resolve. Lily, still clutching the sapphire brooch pinned to her gown, looked between them, confusion knitting her brow. "What do you mean? Not just an heirloom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry gestured to a quieter corner of the reception, away from the swirling dancers and clinking glasses. Eleanor followed, her cane tapping a steady rhythm, though her legs felt unsteady. She didn't know this man, yet his mention of Sarah, her daughter, gone for nearly 2 decades, stirred a storm of emotions. Lily trailed close behind, her gown rustling softly, the brooch glinting under the chandeliers. They sat at a small table, the noise of the celebration fading into the background. Henry clasped his hands, his fingers weathered and scarred, as if they'd known hard work. "I met Sarah in college," he began, his voice low but clear. "We were closer than she ever told you, Eleanor. She shared stories about your family, about the brooch, about Clara." He paused, glancing at the sapphire flower on Lily's gown. "She said it held a secret, one Clara never fully explained." Eleanor's breath caught. Clara had been a private woman, her life shaped by loss. The brooch was her treasure, a symbol of her love for Thomas, but she'd never hinted at anything more. "What secret?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than intended. Henry hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a faded photograph. It showed a young Clara, radiant in her wedding dress, the sapphire brooch gleaming at her chest. Beside her stood Thomas, his soldier's uniform crisp, his smile wide. But there was another figure in the photo, a woman Eleanor didn't recognize, standing close, her hand resting on Clara's shoulder. "This was taken the day Clara married," Henry said. "The woman is Margaret, Thomas's sister. She gave Clara the brooch, but it wasn't just a gift. It was a promise." Eleanor frowned, her mind racing. Clara had rarely spoken of Thomas's family after his death. They drifted apart, swallowed by their own grief. "A promise," Lily echoed, leaning forward, her eyes wide. Henry nodded. "Margaret was part of a resistance group during the war. The brooch wasn't just jewelry, it was a signal, a way to identify allies. Clara didn't know at first, but Thomas told her before he left. The sapphire hid a tiny compartment, used to smuggle messages across enemy lines." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. The brooch, a tool of war? It seemed impossible, yet the weight of Henry's words settled like truth. Lily touched the brooch, her fingers trembling. "Is it still there?" "The compartment." Henry shook his head. "I don't know. Sarah found out about it when she was researching her family history. She wanted to tell you, Eleanor, but the accident," his voice broke, and Eleanor felt a pang of shared grief. Sarah's death had shattered her world, and now this stranger was stitching it back together with threads of a past she'd never known. Eleanor's mind spun. All these years, she'd carried the brooch as a symbol of love, not espionage. Had Clara known its full story? Had she chosen to keep it secret, to protect her family from the dangers it represented? The thought made Eleanor's chest ache. She looked at Lily, who was staring at the brooch with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "Grandma," Lily said softly, "did you ever suspect anything?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Your great-grandmother was a quiet woman. She carried her pain silently. If she knew, she took it to her grave." The words felt heavy, like a confession. Henry reached out, his hand hovering near Eleanor's. "Sarah wanted you to know the truth," he said. "She thought it would bring you closer to Clara, to understand her strength." The reception continued around them, oblivious to the weight of their conversation. A child's laughter broke the tension, and Eleanor glanced at the dance floor, where Daniel was spinning a young cousin, his grin infectious. She wondered what he'd think of this revelation, if it would change how he saw Lily, now the keeper of a secret forged in war. The thought of telling him, if telling anyone, felt daunting. The brooch was no longer just a family heirloom. It was a piece of history, a burden, and a gift. As the band played a softer tune, Henry stood. "I'll leave you to process this," he said, his eyes kind but weary. "But if you ever want to know more, I'm here." He handed Lily a card with his number, then disappeared into the crowd, leaving Eleanor and Lily in a bubble of silence. The brooch seemed to pulse with new meaning, its sapphire catching the light like a beacon. Lily's fingers lingered on the sapphire brooch, its cool surface grounding her as the reception swirled around her. Eleanor sat beside her, her face a map of emotion, shock, grief, and a flicker of pride. The revelation about the brooch had cracked open their family's history, and now the pieces were shifting, reshaping what they thought they knew. The band struck up a lively waltz, pulling guests to the dance floor, but Eleanor and Lily remained at their table, the weight of Henry's words anchoring them. Lily glanced at her grandmother, whose eyes were distant, lost in memories of Clara. "Grandma," she said softly, "do you think great-grandma Clara was a spy?" The word felt absurd, yet it hung between them, heavy with possibility. Eleanor's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Clara? A spy?" She shook her head, but her eyes betrayed uncertainty. She was brave, but quiet. If she was part of something bigger, she never let on. "Not to me." Her voice wavered, and Lily reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. The brooch gleamed on Lily's gown, a silent witness to their family's untold story. As they sat, a new figure approached, a woman in her 60s, her hair streaked with gray, her dress simple but elegant. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her eyes sharp and curious. "Eleanor?" she asked, her voice warm but tentative. Eleanor looked up, startled. The woman smiled. "I'm Margaret's daughter, Alice. Henry told me you'd be here." Eleanor's breath caught. Margaret Thomas's sister, the woman in the photograph. This was another twist, a living link to the past she'd never expected to meet. Lily's eyes widened, and she squeezed Eleanor's hand tighter. "You knew my great-grandmother?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. Alice nodded, settling into a chair. "My mother talked about Clara often. They were close during the war, closer than family. The brooch was her way to keep the Resistance's secrets safe." She paused, her gaze settling on the sapphire flower. It wasn't just a signal. It was a symbol of trust, of women holding the line while the men fought. Her words carried a quiet reverence, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride for Clara, mingled with sorrow for the secrets she'd carried alone. Alice reached into her purse, pulling out a small, leather-bound journal. "This was my mother's," she said, sliding it across the table. "She wrote about Clara, about the brooch, about the messages they smuggled. I thought you should have it." Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the journal, its pages yellowed but intact. Clara's name appeared in Margaret's neat script, alongside stories of late-night meetings, coded letters, and a courage that defied the chaos of war. Lily leaned over, reading a passage aloud. "Clara pinned the brooch to her dress today, her hands steady despite the news of Thomas's death. She said it was her way of keeping him close, of keeping us all close." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, and Eleanor felt her own vision blur. Clara had worn the brooch not just for love, but for duty she'd never shared, perhaps to shield her family from its dangers. The journal changed everything. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a testament to Clara's strength, to the women who'd stood together in the face of loss. Eleanor looked at Lily, her heart swelling with love and fear. "You're part of this now," she said, her voice thick. "This brooch, this story, it's yours to carry." Lily nodded, her fingers brushing the brooch again. "I want to honor it," she said. "Not just for great-grandma, but for all of them." She glanced at the dance floor, where Daniel was laughing with friends, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Eleanor wondered how they'd tell him, how they'd share this legacy without letting it overshadow their joy. Alice stood, her smile soft. "I'll be in touch," she said. "There's more to tell, if you're ready." She left the journal with them and slipped back into the crowd, leaving Eleanor and Lily with a new piece of their history. The reception carried on, its energy unbroken, but for Eleanor, the world had shifted. The brooch was no longer just a memory, it was a call to remember, to carry forward the courage of those who'd come before. The sapphire brooch glimmered on Lily's gown, its petals catching the light as she moved through the reception, now aware of its hidden history. Eleanor watched her granddaughter from her seat, the journal resting in her lap like a sacred text. The weight of Clara's courage, Margaret's trust, and Sarah's unfinished quest pressed against her. But there was a warmth there too, a sense of connection that spanned generations. Lily returned to the table, Daniel at her side, his arm around her waist. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed the journal. Lily hesitated, then smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. "More than okay," she said, glancing at Eleanor. "There's something we need to tell you." They sat, and Lily began to explain, her voice steady as she recounted Henry's revelation and Alice's gift. Daniel listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to awe. "That's incredible," he said, touching the brooch gently. "It's like you're carrying a piece of history." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling. Daniel's acceptance felt like a blessing, a sign that Lily's future would be built on the strength of the past. But as they spoke, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Clara. Had she felt this same mix of pride and fear, pinning the brooch to her dress, knowing its secret? Eleanor wished she could ask her, could thank her for the legacy she'd left behind. The reception was winding down, guests drifting toward the exits, their laughter softer now. Lily and Daniel stood to cut the cake, and Eleanor watched, her eyes misty. The journal had given her a new lens on her mother's life, and she felt closer to Clara than she had in decades. But there was one final piece of the puzzle, one question that lingered. What had become of the compartment in the brooch? Was it still there, hidden beneath the sapphire's glow? As the cake was served, Lily returned, her face flushed with happiness. "Grandma, I want to check the brooch," she said, her voice low with excitement. Eleanor's heart raced. Together, they slipped into a quiet alcove, away from the crowd. Lily carefully unpinned the brooch, her fingers searching its edges. Eleanor held her breath, half expecting nothing but smooth metal. But then, a faint click. Lily gasped as a tiny panel slid open, revealing a hollow space, empty but undeniable. "It's real," Lily whispered, her eyes wide. Eleanor reached out, touching the compartment with trembling fingers. It was small, barely large enough for a folded note, but it was proof of Clara's bravery, of the risks she'd taken. For a moment, Eleanor could almost see her mother young, fierce, pinning the brooch to her dress, carrying secrets that could have cost her life. Lily closed the compartment and repinned the brooch, her movements reverent. "We'll keep it safe," she said, her voice firm. "For great-grandma, for Mom, for all of them." Eleanor nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. The brooch was no longer just a symbol, it was a bridge, connecting them to the women who'd shaped their lives. As the reception ended, guests gathered to send off the bride and groom. Lily and Daniel stood under a shower of petals, the brooch gleaming on her gown. Eleanor watched, her cane steady in her hand, her heart full. She'd passed on more than a piece of jewel-rich past, on a legacy of courage, love, and resilience. The journal, the brooch, the stories, they were Lily's now, to carry into the future. Eleanor lingered as the ballroom emptied, the lights dimming. She thought of Clara, of Sarah, of the women who'd worn the brooch before her. Their strength lived on in Lily, in the life she'd built with Daniel. And though the story of the brooch was far from over, Eleanor felt a quiet peace. She'd done her part, and now it was time to let go.